Good morning, everyone, or if you are in different time zones, good X, whatever X stands for in your context. So I'm going to, first play in window, and then I'm going to share. Yeah. So indeed, this is, I assume, this is going to be quite different talk or topic for many of you. Definitely in this series of webinars, it's very different. I hope it will be inspiring and useful for all of you in terms of the roles design, speculative, and futuring methods can play in sustainable transformations. So as Lisa said, I'm Assistant Professor of Sustainable Design, about to be associate, hopefully, and get my tenure very soon. And I'm a leader of NODUS Sustainable Design Research Group at Aalto University. And that research group mainly focuses on transdisciplinary design research for sustainable futures. A little bit about me. So I was born and raised in Turkey and did my bachelor and master's degrees in Turkey. I'm an engineer as well. And I actually got acquainted with and became really passionate about sustainability during my master's in industrial design, which then took me all the way to New Zealand. And I did my PhD in sustainability science because I really wanted to understand, sustainability and feed it back into design research, design and innovation research. That was, of course, a very perspective widening and shifting experience for me, both because of the degree, the sustainability science, which was pretty kind of pretty new area at the time, and also moving to New Zealand from old world into a context where indigenous presence was quite strong. I would say that I lived 8.5 years in New Zealand, also became a citizen. It has been a transformative experience, both for me personally, but also for my research persona. And my interest is in system innovations and transitions for sustainability. I approach it from a design and innovation direction, and at the intersection of design research and sustainable transformations, there is actually quite vibrant emergent research going on. My empirical interests cover urban sustainable transitions and transformative sustainability, innovation, and business. And I'm a very eclectic researcher in a way. My epistemology is pragmatist, and I do use theories, methods from a multiplicity of research areas, including, of course, sustainability science and transitions management, but systems theories, future studies and foresight, and design theory, as well as transdisciplinary research. I'm a trained foresight practitioner, as well as a trained facilitator, and I would identify myself as a new generation academic. For me, actionable knowledge, creating actionable knowledge is much more significant in my work than doing discovery-based research. So sustainability transitions have been, particularly in the maybe earlier years, have been solely framed as technological challenges, and there had been a lot of techno-fix mindset around sustainable transitions. But of course, now we know very well that they're very complex processes. They're social, economic, and governance challenges, not only technological challenges. And they require fundamentally different systems, structures, and practices to be conceived and implemented in all of these areas combined. So I theorized that sustainable transformations are actually threefold design challenges. What do I mean by that? So first of all, there are creative challenges, because we need to conceptualize new systems, entirely new systems, to replace the unsustainable provisional systems in order to meet the needs of society. This is a cognitively very challenging, creative dimension of sustainable transformations. There are, of course, technical challenges in the sense that it's not enough to, imagine new systems. We need to be able to somehow evaluate these new system concepts and select, design, and deploy those ones that are most promising. And finally, there are also political design challenges, because particularly as transformations accelerate or reach maturation phases, in order to mobilize or accelerate the pace of transformations, we really need, majority of the society on board. We cannot really achieve these with elitist approaches, that happens in kind of behind closed doors of transition arenas, which are very useful in kind of creating the forefront thinking, but unless we bring people on board, we're not going to be able to reach the acceleration rates. So designing participatory and democratic processes of deliberation, not only an ethical requirement, in my opinion, but also a practical requirement. And when I talk about design in the context of sustainability transformations, I mostly get my inspiration from strategic design, which is less about artifacts, but more about strategies and strategic thinking. So in the context of sustainable transformations, design is understood with references to Helsinki Design Lab work from years ago. So it is equally concerned with probing the limits of our current reality as it is with making new realities possible. And I'm going to talk about a project that I was part of between 2013 and 16 as a postdoctoral researcher in Australia. So this project is, the long title of it is Vision Scenarios and Pathways for Low Carbon Resilient Futures in Australian Cities, shortly VP 2040. This project was a design, engagement, and action research all at the same time, led by Victorian Eco-Innovation Lab in the University of Melbourne, where I was based in. And we were collaborating with two other universities alongside partners from private sector and partners from public sector, mostly local governments and state governments, because we were supposed to be also collaborating with the federal government. But 3 months after we started this project, Australia elected Tony Abbott, the famous climate denier, as prime minister, and he had undone overnight a lot of good efforts that had been put into place before him, including a well-functioning carbon tax. So I don't really need to get into the detail of why we should focus on cities in relation to sustainability action in this audience. At the time, urban transitions was just training attention, and so we needed to justify why we should focus on cities. But of course, well, they're where the problem is concentrated. Their agency is increasing. It's really interesting because nation states and nation states are falling a little bit behind in action, and we were seeing alliances of cities learning from one another, and also economically, some cities outperformed their countries, which gave them economic power to do things in a way that they saw to be right. And then last but not least, cities are beehives of creativity and innovation, and they play a very significant role in social movements, reclaiming democratic and environmental rights. So in this project, we followed a design-led methodology, meaning our processes were very participatory. They were iterative. We were constantly evolving our methodology well, as a response to feedback we were receiving from our non-academic partners. And it had creative, analytical, and integrative dimensions, and it was a truly transdisciplinary project. So the kickoff was in late 2013, and it ended in 2016 after I left the project, actually. What I'm going to talk about is the kind of first 2.5 years of the project until after we finalized the scenarios. I'm not going to talk about pathways unless there is curiosity about them. I can give a little bit of information. I wasn't part of that work. There was a lot of quantification going on in the pathways work, but that happened after I left for Finland. So this is in a way, tamed version of a very, very messy research process, as all transdisciplinary research projects are messy, because there's this constant response to the emerging context in methodological choices. But this is a good map of, kind of in retrospect, making sense of what we did. So of course, there was a lot of desktop research, both on, theories of transformations, transitions, empirical work on, foresight, transformative foresight, etc. But also we were researching about weak signals, about innovations, not only technological innovations, but also, social, cultural, organizational, and institutional innovations that could have, if they scaled up, that could have changed the course of trajectories that we were walking on. And this was ongoing work, sometimes much more intense, sometimes less. And then we did visioning workshops in Melbourne and Sydney. They were participatory visioning workshops. I think we had in total around 120 people. And in these workshops, we had commissioned designers as well as us. I was wearing a design researcher hat as well as a sustainability scientist hat. So the commissioned designers were quite critical in harvesting the conversations and immediately kind of transforming what has been envisioned by the participants into mind maps, sketches, etc. So these visioning workshops were followed by week-long design charrettes. So the commissioned designers and us researchers made sense of one, the desktop research, but also what we have heard during these visioning workshops from non-academic experts. We produced more than 100 images, which we call glimpses of the future. So these represent critical moments of the envisioned futures by the participants. And we use these images for all sorts of purposes, but also as research. For research-related purposes. We use them in stakeholder conversations, both official conversations, but also informal conversations, to prompt discussions on, on desirability and plausibility of the glimpses that represent critical moments of the futures envisioned. We did a series of expert interviews, very targeted, thematic, in order to kind of deepen in relation to certain dimensions indicated envisioning workshops. And all of this found kind of ground, or, found its flesh and blood in our work for developing prototype scenarios. So this was a quite long process of making sense of everything we found out and learned and thought. I think we initially had maybe 7 or 8 prototype scenarios, and then we consolidated them into 4. We took them to a scenarios workshop in Adelaide, and the workshop had two main purposes. One was to challenge the internal logic of each scenario and improve them. Test the scenarios from a resilience point of view, and also bring flesh and blood into the scenarios. And finally, we released 4 scenarios that had become, again, both standalone outputs of the project, but also inputs for the pathways work that followed. So now I'm going to show you some examples of the glimpses of the future that we produced. So our aim was to really look at urban context as a complex adaptive system. So we did not want scenarios or visions on, specific provisional systems, which had been the primary way that people had been working towards, like mobility roadmap, energy roadmap, etc. But as we know, these are all interrelated. So we really wanted to have a systemic dimension to our work, and we did design our workshop processes to achieve that. We curated breakout groups very carefully, thinking about, who should we kind of bring together so that the visions will have systemic characteristic. Anyhow, so the resulting, some of the examples of resulting glimpses. So we have these glimpses that are at the micro level, meaning, urban life experienced by residents and at household building scale. Then we have glimpses at community neighborhood scale, and then we have these glimpses that actually are about the large, broader urban environment. Then we had these glimpses that cannot be categorized as such, and they are more critical dialogic objects. Because they, the significance of these glimpses is not being realistic or plausible, but being kind of triggering critical dialogue essentially among the stakeholders. So, for example, this one shows the living road concept. So according to this glimpse, roads are organic, grown. They're also technological. So, they kind of, they're PV cells, and they have Wi-Fi connectivity, etc. And you can see that there's this organic living road fertilizer. So this is what we call speculative design. And we use these glimpses. Well, actually, we used all of the glimpses to get stakeholder responses. But in my experience, these critical dialogic objects, the speculative design based visualizations, had actually prompted much deeper and much more creative discussion. So, for example, when we showed this living road concept, initially, there was a lot of kind of, what is this? Is so not feasible. There's, it's ridiculous. Are we putting money in this project because of this and blah, blah. But then you facilitate that kind of, first reaction out, and you move into a very very creative dialogue. And through prompted by this, at the time, Melbourne City Council had this insight. Oh, this actually, from a symbolic point of view, this actually preempts a new mode of infrastructure governance, where the costs of building infrastructure and maintaining infrastructure, the cost model is kind of changed. So the initial, installation is basically burdened by municipality, but then the community actually, community surrounding, a piece of road takes care of the road, maintains the road, etc. The other critical dialogic object that is my favorite is this, the one on the right-hand side. So one of the designers came up with this image that shows, Melbourne has a river called Yarra, and Melbourne also has frequent heat waves, and frequency is increasing, of course, with climate change. So in this image, what we see is it's 55 degrees Celsius outside, and under the river, there is this cavity where people are partying. And then underneath that layer, there's also this long distance train between Melbourne and Sydney. So this was a quite interesting image, because there was a lot of serendipity associated with what we made out of this. That involved me at the time reading a book on Melbourne, not for research purposes, but as a person who moved to Melbourne and who wanted to understand Melbourne. And that book turned out to be an amazing resource. And I found out that there is this urban exploration group in Melbourne, which started by three teenager boys in 1980s, but which has become one of the largest urban exploration groups of the world and inspired other groups to be formed. And they are called the Cave Clan. They're very secretive because what they're doing is totally illegal. So they're exploring the stormwater channels of Melbourne, and they have mapped the entire system underneath the city. And you can acquire this map if you send them a snail mail to a post office box address, send your address, and they send you the map for free. So finding out about this very serendipitously and prompted with this image resulted in conversations about the potential innovations on urban resilience that we had not thought about before. There's this entire layer under the city, and could that be actually part of resilience plans, etc. So that's the glimpses, and then we both, based on desktop research and based on stakeholder conversations, we identified points of contention among our stakeholders in relation to desirability and plausibility perceptions of certain preempted future innovations or parts of future cities. Some of these are very typical, such as solutions will come from technology development versus no, we already have enough technology. We should not push technology development any further, but we should look at creative ways of using what we already have, etc. And then service life in terms of desirability. Some people find service life very desirable, whereas some people think that a sustainable lifestyle should be productive. So we mapped out these points of contentions, and this is not an all-inclusive list, but the ones that I thought to be very interesting, which fed into developing these 4 prototype scenarios I mentioned before. This is what we took to the workshop. So these prototypes, one for each scenario, shows particular dimensions. So what is the governance like? where did the emission reductions come from? How is the nature of relationships between people? You know, the spectrum is physical, virtual. What's the value system is like in this society, etc. And then after the workshop, we did, of course, work with the data that was gathered in the workshop. And eventually we released 4 scenarios and visualized them. So here you see the visualizations and the keywords that are kind of indicative of the you know, of each scenario. The columns show the scenarios, and then the rows show how would that scenario look like across different generic urban density levels. And these are very high resolution images. So there's a lot of detail in them, and they're also Creative Commons licensed, so anyone can actually use them for their own work if they want to. But essentially, so these are visualizations, but there is quite a lot of course, narrative, a lot of text explaining, you know, what kind of a future this is, how are the provisional systems, you know, from, you know, water to energy to mobility to also how, you know, how this is, how life is or society is financed, what is the value basis, etc., etc. A lot of detail there, which I think the keywords give a good kind of overview. And then each of these scenarios fall across a spectrum on, you know, the where did the emission reductions come from? So theoretically, you know, you can increase efficiency radically or reduce consumption radically across the spectrum. And then each of the scenarios fall onto a different spot on this spectrum. Then this shows the governance and main actors in each scenario. So we played with two dimensions here. One is about governance. So, you know, on the top, it's top down, centralized, do it for me kind of governance. And in the bottom, it's bottom up, decentralized, do it for yourself kind of governance. And then the horizontal axis is the value based, so values system related axis. So on the left, we have the 2 scenarios that are more meritocratic societies. And on the right hand side, we have the two scenarios that have a more egalitarian value base. And we also looked at who are creating these futures now. So these scenarios, of course, are not blueprints, they're not predictions. Their purpose is to create a discussion in the now, challenge the assumptions about what the future could be like, and also bring together the very different types of actors who are advocating, you know, each of these scenarios, because essentially future is going to be a mix of all of these, given that we are seeing the signals of each of these in the present. So this work is in that sense quite insightful, because this work shows, you know, every time you engage in a transition related participatory work, who do you need to bring together? Because there needs to be a lot of deliberation, and these actors need to find ways to negotiate and, you know, agree on certain dimensions of what kind of futures we want and we can move towards. So that's the end of the scenarios related explanation. And then using this work, I also looked at, because I'm a design researcher, I looked at the roles played by design in transition processes, using this project as a case study. So in this slide, you see, according to Dirk Loorbach, 3 activities that are necessary in transition processes. So these are strategic activities, which is about formation of long-term goals and vision development, tactical activities, which is about implementing a change agenda, and operational activities, which are about experimentation and learning by doing at the niche level. So I use this as my analytical framework and analyze lots of data, lots of different types of data, including minutes, meeting minutes, including tabletops of workshops, and also my reflective research journal. And I have mapped the roles that I identified played by design in these kind of 2.5 years that I was part of the project. And as we can see, design plays multiple roles and also across all of these 3 activities. And the interesting finding was that only, I think, 2 of these roles were traditionally attributed by society as this is, you know, a role of a designer, and the rest are not. So then this also is a good, not summary, but this is a good learning for us about how public still understands what design is, which is from a very instrumental point of view, and more often than not, actually only in relation to styling, which is completely, of course, wrong. But the profession has also, you know, been expanding its practices and theories as an, you know, as a profession that is essentially very closely operating in a societal context. And as the societal context changes, profession changes as well, which then, you know, requires us to think about how do we educate, you know, designers for 21st century. And this has informed our curriculum development work in Aalto. And also I know that this has informed curriculum development in other design schools. So that's in a nutshell what we've done in that project, and, you know, some ideas on the outputs. Thank you very much. And I think we have some time for some questions or some discussion and some reflections. Thank you.
Thank you, Idil. This was a very, very excellent overview on your topic. So actually we have our first question coming from, oh no, we don't.
That was me applauding your talk, Idil. Thank you so much. That was very refreshing, a very new perspective, at least for me, because well, my background is more engineering, and I guess our group here, or at least the project, has more an engineering background. So that is absolutely fantastic and eye-opening. Yeah, well, at least I don't see any questions popping up right now and on the chat. So maybe I can go ahead. Well, I have actually 2 questions. You were mentioning emissions. Emission can be many things. Yeah. So I was wondering what kind of emissions you had in mind in this. And then the second question would be, if I guess you have read a little bit about our project that is mainly like greenhouse gas emissions and how we can model and measure this in the urban landscape, and what you would think as in how we can use this more engineering approach to have the best impact to governance, to citizens.
Yeah. So first of all, maybe I should give a little bit of an information on the pathways part. So this part that I have talked about had, involved a lot of qualitative work, but very important work in relation to engaging stakeholders, bringing them together, getting them kind of share, according to their perspective, what is desirable, what is plausible, etc. And then the team used the scenarios, again, as a prompt to start a new phase of research. And so, first of all, the main aim of this project, which was a flagship project of the larger consortium, was to be high level and to give strategic input into the larger consortium about the research priorities to really reduce carbon dioxide emissions or greenhouse gas emissions. So feed into very quantitative, engineering research. So in the pathways part, the team essentially used systems dynamic modeling, and it was very lucky because Australia's CSIRO had developed over many years this systems dynamic model of Australia's entire physical economy. And we had that model, and also we had two systems dynamic modelers. So they have first did some quantitative calculations to demonstrate that, yes, in each of these scenarios, 80% reduction is possible, but based on such and such conditions, to create a dialogue on, what kind of policies might be needed and what kind of futures we actually want to move. Because yes, there are 4 desirable scenarios there, but each scenario is desirable for a different actor group. It's not like desirability is a very value-laden concept. So that work involved quantification, pathway development based on that, and essentially evaluating the pathways and pointing out the challenges, policy challenges and technological, challenges that need to be tackled if Australian cities wanted to, or they had to, but, so that then was fed back into the research priorities, and the, other research projects had very kind of sharp focus, research projects. So that's the kind of complete picture of the project. Maybe that resonates with the engineers in the group more. There was a lot of discussion, of course, on when emissions is greenhouse gas emissions in the urban context, but there was an enormous amount of discussions which I wasn't very actively part of, because I'm not a researcher as such. I'm an engineer by original training as well, but my research has been and is qualitative on, like, where do we draw the boundary, as you would know much better than I do. There's a lot of challenges based on which boundary you select, and of course, essentially a country like Australia, emissions, consumption-based emissions required, if we wanted to be true to the cause, required considering, everything that is exported. So there was a lot of discussions around that, but I'm not able to actually give you kind of like, an account on how did those boundaries were drawn and et cetera. For anyone interested, I can send the pathways report. There is information on how the quantification was done, et cetera. But I can say that I find this kind of work, and this is why I am doing this kind of work, because there is there is a huge, I think, gap between where we really should target in terms of direction and what the policy is signaling us and to particularly to businesses, etc. And this kind of work helps with kind of, to a certain extent, closing the, the imagination gap, and helps with challenging assumptions that we hold on what is plausible and what is not, or what is possible and what is not. Essentially, plausibility is a very, very contested concept. And what we think is plausible or not plausible about the future is based on our assumptions. So this kind of work helps challenging those assumptions, and again, hypothetically helps with unlocking some of the pathways that we may not be able to see by holding on to those assumptions that are very strong and unexamined.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that I can only agree on that. There is in the chat, maybe you want to read that by yours. Oh, yeah, I can read it. There's another question, more a comment. I seen something you said in the intro, a link to ICOS, to the ICOS Cities project, creating actionable knowledge. I was actually wondering the same. So, yeah, maybe if you want to spend a minute on what you think is an actionable knowledge, or how we can achieve it actually.
Yeah, I think that there's a whole discourse on this in transition literature. For me, actionable knowledge is knowledge that we can act upon immediately. And this is not to say that we only need actionable knowledge in the context of transformations. So there is this really nice typology of knowledges that are needed to change systems in Christian Paul's work. And they talk about interrelated, but 3 types. So it's systems knowledge that kind of answers the question of, what is happening now, what we are observing, what has happened that resulted in the current situation. So understanding the system that needs to be changed, essentially. And that requires lots and lots of discovery-based knowledge, of course. And then there is target knowledge. So that's a bit more normative, as well as, of course, we have very quantitative targets, but then there's also the value base that we should be thinking about. So target knowledge is essentially answering the question of where should we go and how should we do that? And then transformation knowledge is the knowledge that is, kind of linking systems knowledge and transformation knowledge. So it's, shifting the current system, the current status of the system to desirable, sustainable, target knowledge. So transformation knowledge is, in my understanding, is actionable knowledge. And that is, that generation of that knowledge happens in real life through experimentation, because we really don't know, for certain, what kind of paths will take us to post-carbon resilient, etc., because, reality is a complex adaptive system. But the only way to walk the paths is to learn about the path as we walk them. So that is creating actionable knowledge. Does this answer the question?
Yes, thank you. I think it clarified a lot, and I still have the same view as when writing the comment that yes, this is a very nice way of defining the role of ICOS, and especially the goals of this project better than what we have done earlier in the project sort of proposal and description. I think that this is something which I'm going to use as basis of discussions of the strategy and so on. So yep, starting from here, and I'm going to learn more. Thank you for putting me to the beginning of this path.
There is a question from David. Thank you, David, for asking a question. During the planning process, was discussed the possible trade-offs between making a very sustainable city versus a very resilient city. For example, a high-tech and efficient city may be successful in yes. Well, yes, but not as capable of facing, yes. Thank you, David. Actually, the 4 scenarios that we developed tried to prompt such discussions, because what we are of course observing is a tendency towards walking the clean tech market-based living, which is a projection of business as usual, and the assumption is that technological development and technological development will help us to reduce emissions to the needed level, which is essentially, this is the view mostly promoted by policymakers, mostly loved by businesses, etc. But then in that scenario, we actually showed that, well, of course, on one hand, it's not really possible with purely kind of technological development driven by market forces to reach that amount of emission reduction. But even if we assume, it would be a very unequal society with haves and have-nots and increased poverty, etc. In order to also make people reflect on those dynamics. There's no easy answer, and again, as I said, the future, or the real future that we would live if we were to reduce emissions down to that level would have elements of all of those 4 scenarios. But the important thing is having those discussions now, because we are making decisions in the now that is facilitating unfolding of certain futures while hindering unfolding of certain other futures. So in that sense, scenarios aimed to kind of both visually and textually articulate, those dynamics, and have people to reflect on them and think about them and change policies or innovation strategies with references to them. Of course, it's not going to happen in one night, but creating such discussions in transition arenas or ecosystems is quite critical. Does this answer your question, David? David? Yes, excellent, great. Any other questions? We have 6 minutes left. That's fine, David.
We don't seem to have any more questions. Still some time.
Yeah.
To make them.
Maybe one comment is, this is actually quite typical silence when I speak to audiences that come from a very technical background. So humbly sharing maybe a thought. That technical knowledge is incredibly, of course, fundamental, because there's measurement, there is, evidence-based target setting, etc. But given the challenge of, mobilizing whole societies and the amount of change and the pace that is required to create that change, of course, we also know that quite fundamental things need to shift in society. I mean, we need to move from a consumerist society in the West to a society that is not consumerist. And that kind of research is also emerging from many, many places. And what is, I think, needed more is interaction between research groups who are doing this kind of, speculative, futuring, speculative design work, and groups who are doing the technical work. And one of the strengths in this project was that, we had the systems dynamic modeling part, because without that, the work would not necessarily be, it wouldn't be a leverage point at all, because, there's a scenario, a narrative, and nice images, but, what does this mean from an emission reduction point of view, etc. So bringing that kind of flesh and blood is really important. I do see that, there's a lot of potential for transformative research if, communities actually collaborate. It's starting to happen. One, of course, example is that we are in the Pole project. We're not doing any work that's similar to this, of course. But I think, it's phenomenally amazing that a design school is part of a consortium as such. So that work is emerging, and I hope to see that happening much, in a much broader, wider sense.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the silence here is not that we don't have questions. It is more that it is probably a very new viewpoint and a lot to digest, at least for me. I can only talk for myself, but it is fabulous. Yeah, I really looking forward to think more. Yeah. In a holistic way. That is, yes.
Yes, I think, there's a lot of cutting edge research opportunity when you cross the boundaries and when you kind of start to, very challenging because epistemologies are very different, terminologies are very different, communication is difficult, etc. But the world needs that kind of research, and I'm really grateful that I had the opportunity to talk here, and also very grateful that we're part of Pole. Thank you, Maria. Yeah. And if anyone has further questions, or if you would like to receive the reports of the project, also, the visualizations are Creative Commons licensed, so you may want to use them. I'm happy to provide all of them to anyone who is interested.
I think we could share them online too, on the ICOS Cities Talks net or website.
Sure. And I just wrote my email in the chat in case anyone would like to contact me later. But thank you for listening to me and inviting me.
Well, thank you for your nice presentation. Let's hope to hear back from people. So a reminder that the feedback form is in the chat again, so don't forget to fill it in. And thank you everybody for showing up and listening.
And yes, needless to say, we are open for business in Nodus. If you are looking for a partner who could do this kind of work in an EU project, we are here and very happy to be involved.